Hey, welcome to the Deeper Bible Podcast. We're all about digging deep into the beauty of the scriptures, thinking about big ideas in theology and philosophy, and also bringing it home to practical wisdom for our life today. And we believe that wisdom is something for everybody, God's wisdom. So if this show is helpful for you, we'd appreciate it if you'd click like or subscribe to our channel or share this with a friend or drop a review into YouTube or Apple Podcasts. And that would be a great help to us. My name is Ryan, and today I'm sitting here with the most important guest that the Deeper Bible Podcast has ever had or will ever have. I can guarantee that because I'm sitting here today with the love of my life, my wife, Sarah Gregg.
Hi there.
And hello. And Sarah is a licensed marriage and family therapist. And so today we're going to talk about a topic that has been important in my life, but has been very important in her life. It's the topic of mental health. And we're just going to learn about what the Bible has to say about that. And, Sarah in a sermon recently was sharing with the church my own struggles with an anxiety disorder and intrusive thoughts and the season of life during grad school. And I mean, it just brought me low. Like there was just no going forward without some serious help. And I learned an enormous amount about myself and about the brain and about God. It was hugely humbling. So just to get us started off, would you mind just telling us a little bit about why you got into mental health, becoming a therapist? How did that develop for you? And I'll have you speak right into the microphone.
So I can go back and think about middle school actually, and how I would have friends come up to me and just start sharing their life with me. Mm-hmm. And I just as a natural...
People never do that to me.
I wonder why. Interesting. And just my natural temperament, I'm more of a listener than I am a talker. Mm-hmm. And you've noticed that. But anyways, I just had friends just always come up to me and talk to me. And so it was just kind of always, I was that friend. Mm-hmm. And, I took a psychology course in high school, and then it was something that intrigued me. And so I pursued that in my bachelor's degree. And I loved it. And then pursued that in my master's degree. And it's been such a rewarding path for me. Mm-hmm. And I just love just the privilege of getting to sit with clients on a daily basis and really enter their lives. Some really dark times. So that's kind of been my story. And I think even on a personal level too, this field resonates with me because I've also struggled with mental health. With anxiety, with depression, and, we can go into this later, but part of what's been important in my life has been recognizing when I'm moving towards a place of more anxiety or more depression and actually knowing what skills to do, to use to help myself get through that.
Yeah. Thanks for saying all that. And I honestly, Sarah, I learned so much I admire your work so much, the suffering, the crisis, the uncertainty, and that you're equipped by God to sit with them in the middle of that. In many ways, I look at you as a pastor that's more pastoral than me. My work is with books and words and ideas, and that's where I serve. I love that your place of service is right in the heart of people's crisis. And God has equipped you to not let it affect you overly deeply. I would be destroyed if I sat with people in such tough situations. It would consume me. But I think you're equipped by God to be able to inhabit that space and do it with grace. So,
Thank you.
I really admire you, and I've learned so much from you. So why, when I was growing up, we never talked. Mental health was like a phrase you did not hear. If you did hear it, it was like related to like weirdos in a loony bin, or it was not a dignified and real thing. And the idea was if you're struggling with depression or anxiety or whatever, just like snap out of it. You're fine. Toughen up. Get some tough skin or just pray harder or whatever.
Yeah.
When I was in grad school and struggling with intrusive thoughts I believe in all that stuff, but none of it was helping. And so I'm curious, like from your perspective, why are some people or some cultures or some households like this is sort of a taboo topic? We don't talk about that. Why is that? And just share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I resonate with what you said too. Like I didn't talk about mental health or hear about mental health until honestly I was in college, really. But I think each family just comes from a different background or even just a different culture, different times. I think right now we're living in a time where emotions are everywhere. Therapy is less, there's less stigma to therapy and mental health.
Yeah.
And it's very common to get the phrase, just toughen up, or in the church, like just pray harder, have more faith. And
I've been thinking about, because for my parents, your parents, and especially our grandparents, this whole area is a mystery. They're kind of like, what? Well, those millennials are talking about their emotions again.
Yeah.
Why is that? And I'm trying to make sense of it. And I think a couple different frameworks. Maslow, I think it's Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of our basic needs.
Yes.
And like it starts at the physiological level. Like you need water, you need food, you need a roof. If you go up above that, then you need like other people in your life and whatever. And then it goes up into like a self-actualization. And our parents and our grandparents grew up in the Great Depression. They grew up in some tougher times when lower on the hierarchy of needs were real things.
Yeah.
But as we live today, where honestly, our cupboards are full. I will have food tomorrow because it's in the cupboard already. We have less anxiety at that level, but the anxiety has been displaced now into what are called internalizing disorders as opposed to externalizing disorders or, freaking out. But, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst guy, said that insofar as people get more secure socially, they become more insecure mentally.
Wow.
And I think that's a very interesting insight because you have people having profound anxiety attacks.
Yeah.
And it's like, you live in a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. Like you got a pool in your backyard. You are safe.
Yeah. Right.
But they're like, no, I'm profoundly not safe. And so there's this miscommunication between the generations. And it was profound. I'm very grateful that I'm a pastor who has gone through some of that. So it doesn't fall in the bucket of like, oh, come on, seriously, grow up. It actually falls in the bucket of that is profoundly painful and profoundly hard. And it's going to be a process. And then my relationship with you has been so affirming and insightful. And do you want to just recount for people how we met real quick? How do you recall us meeting?
Sure. Well, I knew about you because I've been going to this church for a long time. So I knew that Pastor Gregg had a family. I knew that he had a son and he would come and preach every so often. But
early sermons unavailable online, the bloopers.
But I think one of our first interactions was during COVID, summertime. We were at some serving event at church.
Yes.
And we crossed paths.
Yes.
And had very brief interaction, but an interaction.
Yep.
And I think from there, it was just a year of just crossing paths and just
literally
hellos.
A year. Yeah. Yeah, this was COVID. So it was like, she's, wearing these masks. So it's like Saudi Arabia. I had no idea what this girl looks like. I only see the eyes. And I was writing my dissertation. And so it was pretty tunnel vision focused on that. And, but the day I finished my dissertation, I'm driving home and I just had this like weird out of nowhere sensation. Like, I really want to tell Sarah about this. And I was like, what the? And then my dad was like, you should take Sarah, right after I finished my dissertation, you should take Sarah Voss out to coffee.
Thanks, Dad.
And I did. And that was a 4-hour coffee chat.
It was.
And things took off from there. And we were married less than a year later.
Yeah, that's right.
And and we're expecting our first in a month. So happy times.
Yes.
And well, let's continue with our topic then for today, Sarah. Yeah. So as a therapist, you use certain tools, certain therapeutic frameworks, theories of change. One of the gold standards, and I know that you use this a lot in your practice, is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And we've talked about how the Bible anticipates some of the insights of cognitive behavioral therapy by many, many centuries.
Yeah.
What is CBT, and how does it interact with things that we learn in the Bible?
Sure. Well, it's one of many theoretical approaches to use in counseling, but I found that I drifted towards this approach sort of intuitively, but then I realized this is the foundation of the Bible. Like the Bible talks so much about, well, just to give you a gist of CBT, CBT says, if you change what you think, you change what you feel. And so it really goes back to what are you thinking about? And sort of changing, or what we call like cognitive restructuring, kind of restructuring the thoughts in our mind. And then eventually that will shift how we feel and then change how we behave. And so it's this cycle.
So the behavior flows out of the feelings?
Yes. You could think of it, I think I tell my clients all the time, like think of it as like a triangle. And so at the top, we've got our thoughts. On one corner, we've got our feelings. Then we've got our behaviors. But they're all connected, right? So our behaviors can affect what we think. Our feelings can affect what we think about. So they're all connected. But
and so maybe the particular challenge or illness that you're trying to care for would dictate which part of the triangle you come in on. Because my experience is that cognitive behavioral therapy is about exposing yourself deliberately through behavior to those things that cause anxiety or sort of your worst case scenario, and retraining your mind to say, it's actually not that scary. So it's marrying that behavioral and the cognitive dimension. And if you only do one or the other, you're actually not doing the full thing. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and what you're talking about is like an intervention within CBT to kind of expose yourself to something, which then also then shifts the way that you think about the situation.
Right.
But but change the way you think, change the way you feel, ultimately leads to change in behavior. And the Bible talks a lot about the way that we think.
That's stinking thinking.
And not only in Proverbs, but in other parts of Scripture. Again, we talk about renewing of your mind or taking every thought captive in the book of Corinthians. So for me, my work feels so near to the Bible because that's what God is trying to help us do, is really shape, train our thinking into something more accurate, something based on reality, which is the Bible.
You know, I think too about that verse you quoted in Romans 12, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But in the prior verse in Romans 12:1, it talks about offering your body as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, whatever. So that seems to get to both poles of that cognitive behavioral therapy. Your body, what you actually do in space-time, and your mind. Both of these things are required to live a life in flow with God's flourishing.
Right. And in your sermon on mental health, you talked just about that body-mind connection, right? What you do with your body affects your mind.
Yes.
What goes on in your mind affects your body.
Yes. Yes. So can we talk about, and here I'm asking as your husband and also just as a man, tell me about emotions. I've heard of them.
Oh, I love them.
So tell me about them. What are these things?
Sure.
And how do they fit into our identity? How do we work with them? How do we interpret them? All of the above.
Yeah. I think at a basic level, emotions are pieces of information. And
data, I like it.
Yes. They're neither good or bad, right? I think we'll often say like these negative emotions or these positive emotions.
Right.
And sure, they feel like that, right? Like there's a sort of like experiential component to that. But emotions are just neutral. They tell us about ourselves, about our world. And it doesn't mean that it's always true, right? Because we've got to have a sort of a compass for our emotions. But anyways, we'll get to that in a little bit. So emotions are pieces of information. They tell us what's going on within ourselves and within our world, and they help us navigate our life. So think about anger, right? Anger comes up if you've been wronged or there's some sort of injustice, then you can act on that. Or if you're sad, it tells you that you've experienced loss. Or if you're anxious, right, tells you that there's something to be afraid of. And so every emotion tells you something. And I think that's why it's such a gift, right? God allows us to experience these things that help us navigate the world. Now,
can I interject something?
Sure.
I was reading the other day, actually just yesterday, I think, in St. Augustine's City of God. And 4th century, brilliant thinker. And he's comparing Christianity versus some of the Stoic ways of being, which would say, like, don't be angry at all. If you're angry at anything, it shows that you're misattached, that you've become attached to something that's a vanishing nothingness. Augustine says, for our discipline as Christians, it's not whether we get angry, but why we get angry. It's not whether we get sad, but why we get sad. There are some things that should make you sad.
Yeah.
There are some things that should make you angry.
Right.
And the spectrum of emotions in the book of Psalms really dignifies that whole, palette of emotional combinations and flavor. David's all over the map. And there's something dignifying about that as opposed to a Stoic view that says, like, all emotions misunderstand the nature of reality,
Yeah, it's a good point and a good distinction too. But you're right, we're going to feel emotions, right? We're human, they're normal. And it's what we do with our emotions that can become good or bad or unhealthy or healthy. And I think that's why it's important to have a biblical compass for our lives, because if our belief system, if our thought processes are based on something that's not true, our feelings are going to follow that. They're not going to be aligned with reality. And so part of stewarding that gift of our mind is to really start from the bottom. What are we believing?
Right.
What is the truth here? And then everything flows.
So how does that differ if you're working with a client who either is or is not a Christian or has some religious framework at all or none? Or how does that work with the different clients you spend time with?
Yeah. Well, it certainly changes if I have a client who's Christian or who believes in the Bible, because we can go back to the truth. We can go back to some other standard. If I have clients who are not Christian, it's a bit challenging for me as a Christian therapist, right? Because I know that there's something deeper that we could really stand on. But for this client who doesn't have that worldview, it's really just helping them explore how their thoughts are impacting their life and helping them to find healthier ways of thinking, and then allowing
healthier defined by who, though?
Good point.
I remember when I was looking for a therapist, because I'm a graduate student in philosophy and everything, and I'm just like, I have to have a Christian therapist, because if I have somebody who has a different view of the soul, of the psyche, of materiality, like, that will lead to a profoundly differently framed type of relationship.
Yeah.
But then what was so hard for me is I came in and I wanted to be, all right, teach me, what do I need to know? And he's like, no. What do you want to talk about? And I'm like, I'm paying you. You tell me. And he's like, that's not how this works.
Yeah.
And so it was like that process of self-discovery, but within the parameters of, I am not the ultimate arbiter of what's true or false, right or wrong. And that those guardrails were really important even if they're not Christian. Like, if you don't have anything that tells you what up or down is,
right,
things get harder. And I'm curious, Sarah, like, as a therapist, do you ever in therapeutic context talk about the idea of sin? Does that ever come up?
With my Christian clients at times.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how does sin interact with, like, suboptimal mental experiences or emotions or very impossible, hard situations that people are in, and yet sin is still a reality? Because in my experience, very often the therapeutic community participates in this larger modernist movement that has a very optimistic anthropology. It assumes humans are good. If humans do anything bad, it's because their social environment, their education has mistreated them in some way.
Right.
And so it ultimately erodes moral responsibility. And so sin is a category mistake. And it's chemical imbalance, it's social oppression, it's any number of forces, but it's not sin.
Yeah.
And if it is, even if this gets into questions about the justice system and the prison system, because it's like society still says at certain levels, sorry, what you did is wrong and we're actually going to lock you up. But even then, what the criminal justice system might say about wrongdoing is very different from what sort of modern philosophy might say about wrongdoing.
Yeah.
And how in that mix, how in this, and then if I could just throw one more layer on top of this before you respond, many have observed a larger movement in Christian thought in the last 100 and 150 years, and it's often called the therapeutic turn, or the idea, or another phrase that you'll hear is Christianity has become moralistic therapeutic deism. It's this sort of high-minded, right or wrong, God's going to help us with our own therapy process, and God's this gas. We're very fuzzy in our theology, but the point is that God wants me to be happy and be well-adjusted and be good. And a lot of our worship songs are about that. A lot of our sermons are about that. Here, overcome your discouragement, overcome your whatever. And it's like I thought the gospel was about like the renewal of the cosmos. I thought it was about the story of Israel. I thought it was about, so there is also at stake here this larger question of what are the overlap and divergence points between Christianity, what the gospel offers and what therapy offers. And in that conversation, one of the most contested areas is sin. And sin of different sorts. Sin of a private sort. I do something in my room nobody knows about. Sin of a public sort. I participate in economic structures of oppression and so forth. So, just setting the table. Tell me about
there's a lot there.
Tell me about sin as a therapist.
Sure. Well, again, it's different depending on what clients you're working with. I think another challenge for a therapist in this regard is it's never my job to tell clients what to do or to well, I'll say it this way. It's more helpful.
As a pastor, I get to do that all the time. I love it. Just kidding. I'm sorry. I keep interrupting you.
No, well, I'm thinking about, for me, I think it's helpful to be like a mirror, right? So instead of being very just blatant about what's going on, really being a mirror to the client and helping them to see themselves so that they can realize on their own what's going on. Now, that requires some level of awareness. It requires a willingness to look at yourself. And so if there is sin going on and you're not able to or willing to look at yourself in the mirror, then things are not going to move forward. Or so I think for me, it's really helping clients to understand the way that their behaviors, their ways of thinking are actually impacting their life, and letting them come to that conclusion on their own. So I think that's probably how I would answer that question. But then you also talked about the sort of like, how did you phrase it? The
therapeutic turn.
Therapeutic turn.
It's the question of, many have essentially tried to make Christianity into a sort of therapeutic regimen. And in so doing, it's not that God doesn't care about this part of our life. It's that if that's all that we make it about, we've reduced it. We've taken the rich, multi-layered reality and kind of boiled it down to one facet and said that's the whole thing. And our culture, our individualistic, materialistic culture, very much makes that a convenient way to read the Bible.
Sure.
And but boy, it's a long stretch from the sort of questions and concerns that the ancient Jewish people had that produced the Bible. So it almost feels like it's more like we're too inward focused. That's an interesting question. A lot of historians of philosophy point to the history of inwardness and how the sort of interiority that you and I assume, the very structures of selfhood and components of selfhood that you and I assume are historically constructed. They're not there from all time. Like I'm interested in the story of Moses in the Old Testament and his wild adolescence and crazy, story of becoming and everything. But he's not trying to construct an identity for himself in the modern sense of the term. The modern sense of the term identity, according to Francis Fukuyama down at Stanford, it's adversarial. It's my inner self that is not sufficiently appreciated by my culture surrounding me, and my culture needs to change. I don't need to accommodate myself to culture. Culture needs to accommodate itself to me. I'm seeking expressive, individualistic becoming. Well, whatever the story of Moses may be about, it ain't about that, because he lived in a very different culture.
Yeah.
But so we got to be careful. There's this cultural distance between ourselves and a book like the Bible. And while we can learn lessons that are very valid for our time, we have to be careful that we're not reading our own anxieties in a very alien fashion.
Right.
And making the Bible say things it never meant to say, answering questions it never even posed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a sort of a trend to watch, to be aware of. But again, just circling back to what I was saying some moments ago, none of that undercuts the important work of pursuing mental health, of therapy, and practices like meditation, gratitude, being in community.
Yeah.
You know, we live in an age where loneliness is, I mean, the Surgeon General of the United States wrote to the New York Times about how loneliness is literally killing us. Like, it's like the health outcomes associated with it are bad as smoking a pack a day. Like, it's physically hurting you.
Yeah.
San Mateo County just declared a public health emergency of loneliness.
Wow.
So, I mean, this is non-controversial data-based findings about how the way we're doing life today in our hyper-connected world are actually eroding mental stability. And it's worse
not working.
among the youngsters. And Jonathan Haidt's recent book, The Anxious Generation, gets to this, as do many other books.
Yeah.
He's maybe the most prominent person who's now spoken to it. Now people are paying more attention. But you know, and that's where I've loved your work with youngsters, teenagers, young people who are just thrown into a world that can be very destabilizing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think you've answered my question about what emotions are. They're data. I appreciate that. Yeah, here's a question, Sarah. So there's like two buckets. You know, there's actual like disorders, OCD, autism, schizophrenia, dementia, anxiety and depression disorders. Then there's these other sorts of things that we all encounter in life: loneliness, heartbreak, disappointment, this whole, you know, variety of non-optimal experiences. What happens when none of that gets healed and it's never ultimately healed in our life? Say I've got like intense autism and it's really hard, but no amount of therapy is going to make me not autistic.
Yeah.
How do we approach that? How do you think about that as a therapist? And how do we think about that as Christians?
Yeah, well, I think as Christians, we know that we live in a broken world, and that on this earth we're going to experience the sort of breakdown of our minds and our bodies, and that's just a reality. Now, obviously, there's hope. We know that like there is ultimate healing beyond this, but I think for a lot of us, especially when it comes to like things like depression or anxiety or whatever it may be, I've noticed that a lot of Christians can feel like they're failing at being a Christian because they're still experiencing these things.
Right.
And at a just a basic level, it's just part of living in this world. Not to say that everyone's going to be depressed or anxious, but we all have something. Again, whether it's in our physical bodies or whether it's in our minds.
Yep.
And it doesn't mean that God can't heal us. It doesn't mean that God doesn't see us. It just means this is something that we're going to have to work on. Like I was mentioning earlier with kind of my sort of like natural bent towards depression, I have just seen it as it being kind of part of my temperament or kind of the way that I process through things. It can be really easy for me to kind of go down that route. But if I'm aware of it, if I know what to look for, I can act on it more quickly and really kind of help myself get through it. But I don't think that it's God not healing me. I just think that this is part of what it means to live in this world. And it's always going to require some work to, again, kind of realign ourselves back on a better path, a healthier path in our minds. Yeah.
And it's amazing that our minds with neuroplasticity and the, you know, neuroscientific realities are actually plastic and can remap and reconfigure neural relationships, have whole new neurons and epigenetic layers of modification, and like it's a cellular reality, and that's a that's a very profound thought as well. And
It is.
the nature of the mind is something that fascinates me.
It is very
This
fascinating.
actually was one of the points of that it helped woo me to you, dear. When I was like, because you have a very deep understanding of the mind and the brain, and I thought that was so cool, and I still think that's so cool.
Yeah, we do talk about the brain often.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you were talking about like the neurons, and
Yeah.
one thing that I'll kind of talk to clients about is the way that our neurons, the more that we do something, the more that we think about something, or the way that we think about something, it just strengthens this sort of like neural pathway in our brain. And I think that's why it's so easy. It can feel so, not easy, maybe that's the word. It can feel so easy to go down a specific way of thinking, or we find ourselves doing the same thing over and over again. It's because those pathways are just strengthened. It's kind of like walking through the woods and there's this defined path, right? Your brain knows that path. It's very familiar with that path. And so it's just going to take it. And, but what's great about neuroplasticity is that those pathways can change, and it requires work because we need to really pause before kind of going down this automatic pathway in our brain. But it does take work to pause and to make a change in that. And Proverbs in the chapters, I think 4 through 5, talk about like ponder the path. Actually, I have it here. Ponder the path of your feet, then all your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil. Or even Proverbs 14 says, the simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. And just thinking about like pondering the path, whether that's behaviorally or even like the pathway of our sort of like neural connections, right? Like how can we be more intentional about changing the way that we think about things so that new pathways are created? Yeah. Wow. That's kind of what my work does most often, is like, how do we change your way of thinking? How do we find more realistic, more accurate ways to think about yourself and the world, which then can create new beliefs, new ways of thinking, new behavior, new emotions.
You're such a good question asker. You know, I think Jesus was a great question asker. That was part of his strategy of teaching. And just the right question can cast a whole new angle of light on a problem that you just haven't seen that way. But when you see it that way, it just changes things. Yeah,
it's kind of like a key. It just kind of unlocks something.
Yeah.
And it really allows someone to like see very different.
Or using a metaphor in the right way can just totally shift. And again, Jesus did this all the time.
Yeah.
The kingdom is like that seed, or, you know, is like that net or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Sarah, what would you say to somebody today who's trying to care for somebody who's struggling with mental health, a parent who has a teenager, or maybe someone who has a grandparent with dementia or a parent with dementia, or they are caretakers involved with somebody who's really struggling with their mind? What would you suggest?
Well, I'm thinking of a couple of things, because you mentioned like dementia, where that's like, that's not going to change, right? They're just going to kind of, their minds are going to continue to deteriorate. And then there are things like other disorders, right? Depression or anxiety, that there can be changes.
Right.
So I think my response would be different. But I think because most of my work is revolved around like different disorders that can actually change and shift, I think I would probably say to really just listen to what that person is coming to you with. I think a lot of us can be kind of afraid of someone else's emotions. And so maybe we'll say something like, just, I'll be praying for you, which is good. Like, let's pray for them. But really taking the time to listen. And you don't have to have all the answers or know the right thing to say, but there's enormous power in just being a listening ear. And I think maybe for someone who's with someone whose mind is going to continue to deteriorate and there is no chance of shift, like someone with dementia, really reminding them of the hope that Jesus brings, right? Not just in this life, but like in the life to come, that there is ultimate healing, and that is something to look forward to.
Yeah. And I think too, I'm put in mind of the Christian concept of agape, where you love someone just because of their being, because that they are, not even who they are or what they can do, but just who they are.
Yeah.
And I think about caring for somebody whose faculties are continually and irreversibly declining.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a place to tap into agape, where I love you just because you exist. And this is why I respect you so much, because you operate in waters where words are not easy, and where rationalization is not easy.
Yeah.
And yet it's just in those places where grace and transformation and ultimately hope are born.
Yeah.
And so, this has given me a lot to think about, Sarah. And I want to thank you for making some time to come talk. I mean, we talk about this stuff all the time, but thanks for sharing with our listeners.
Of course.
And I hope we can, this can be a continuing discussion, and maybe we can explore different aspects of this in time ahead. Friends, I hope this was helpful for you. If it was, we'd be grateful if you'd click like or drop a comment or a review or subscribe or share with a friend. Wisdom is for everyone. And when you do those things, it helps us get the truth of God out. So we're a ministry based in Concord, California. We're in the Bay Area. We're at the Bay Church. We'd love to see you sometime, either in person or online at thebay.church. That'll give you all the information you need. And until we see you next time, take care. As the rabbis say, shalom, homies. Take care.